Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're getting into a super brief, but honestly incredibly powerful document. It's called the Avdel Night Shift Policy Proposition. You know, if you've ever managed a team, worked a grueling midnight shift, or really just tried to introduce a brand new workflow at the office, you know for a fact that rolling out new processes is rarely easy. We're going to decode exactly how this text tackles one of the absolute most stubborn challenges in workplace dynamics, and we'll see why its solutions, which were literally forged in the reality of a factory floor, were just remarkably ahead of their time. Let's dive in.
So let's start right at the root of the issue with a pretty fundamental question. Why do workers resist innovation? I want you to really think about that for a second. Have you ever noticed that when new ideas or fresh processes or supposedly helpful innovations get introduced, the immediate reaction from the team usually isn't, a round of applause? Actually, scratch that. It's almost never a round of applause. Instead, it's defensiveness. Even when a change is explicitly designed to make everyone's life easier and take the heavy lifting off their plates, the walls just immediately go right up. Why is that our default human setting at work?
Okay, let's dive into this. The Avdel proposition hits on this exact psychological phenomenon right out of the gate. The text explicitly states, when creativity and innovation would be helpful to both supervision and worker alike, defensiveness and resistance are all too often the pattern of worker reaction. It's a completely fascinating, almost paradoxical human behavior, isn't it? Even when an innovation is a clear, undeniable win-win, we actively push back against the very thing that's meant to help us out. The document doesn't frame this as some weird anomaly either. It frames it as the expected, standard pattern of reaction. Now, naturally, this dynamic creates a massive amount of tension. It's like a giant tug-of-war. On one side, we have worker resistance, and pulling on the other side, we have supervisor power. Think about it. When a worker pushes back against a new idea, what does a supervisor usually do? Well, they push harder. They bring their formal power and their organizational authority to bear, basically trying to force the innovation through. It's literally Newton's third law applied to management. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. The worker resists, the supervisor flexes their authority to demand compliance, and the gap of trust between them, it just widens entirely. And this brings us to a crucial point. This creates a highly toxic, escalating loop. The Avdel text formally defines this as the vicious cycle. When supervisory power is brought to bear against worker defensiveness, it inevitably causes even more resistance. It's a totally self-defeating prophecy. The supervisor uses power to smash through the roadblock. The worker feels threatened, micromanaged, and frankly undervalued, so they just dig their heels in even deeper. Then, the supervisor sees that as blatant insubordination and clamps down harder. It's an exhausting loop that traps absolutely everybody, drains morale, and completely kills any chance of actual productive innovation on that night shift. Nobody wins here. Which brings us to the absolute most critical question of this entire explainer. How do we eliminate this vicious cycle? If flexing managerial power just breeds further resistance, what on earth is the alternative? How do you actually get a team to embrace change, adopt new systems, and drive productivity without resorting to a never-ending tug-of-war? Well, the beauty of the Avdel text is that it doesn't just point out the problem and leave us hanging. It actually offers a profound structural and philosophical shift as the ultimate solution. Now, what's really interesting here is the stark contrast in what they propose. The traditional, old-school management fix would be delegating more authority to act, which basically means giving supervisors even more levers to pull, tighter oversight, or creating stricter rules to force compliance. But the Avdel proposition, they advocate for the exact opposite approach. They propose granting more freedom to produce. Just let that sink in for a second. The entire paradigm completely shifts from top-down control to bottom-up empowerment. It's all about removing the friction and that heavy hand of authority so the worker actually desires to produce rather than merely being ordered to do it under threat of a penalty. But how do you actually do that, right? To turn this lofty philosophy of granting freedom into a tangible daily reality, the Avdel proposition establishes 3 very specific structural policies for the night shift. And I love this because they didn't just leave it as some vague, feel-good, motivational poster. They grounded their philosophy in highly actionable, non-negotiable tenets that leadership absolutely must follow on the floor. Let's look at exactly how they structured this new environment of freedom to effectively dismantle that vicious cycle once and for all. So, here is the high-level ladder of those 3 interconnected policies. Step 1, fair treatment and respect. Step 2, a safe and pleasant environment. And Step 3, opportunity to learn and progress. Now, notice the deliberate structure here. They logically sequence and build upon one another, kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but applied directly to the factory floor. Because think about it, You literally cannot realistically have learning and progress if the environment isn't fundamentally safe. And a physically safe environment means absolutely nothing if there isn't a baseline of respect between management and the worker.
Let's look at the absolute bedrock of this framework, Policy 1. The text says, to deal with each employee fairly and to give respect to him and his ideas. Breaking the cycle of defensiveness absolutely has to start right here. Think back to that vicious cycle we just mapped out. Resistance happens because the worker feels their perspective, their daily lived reality on the floor, is being completely ignored by top-down power. By officially mandating fairness and genuinely valuing worker ideas as a strict policy, you instantly disarm that resistance. You're communicating directly to the worker, hey, you are a vital collaborator here, not just some replaceable cog in the machine.
Let's move to and see how this builds directly into the second policy, which is to provide a safe and pleasant work environment. Once you've actually established that baseline of mutual respect and fairness, you have to actively support it in the physical and mental workspace. I mean, a worker who feels physically unsafe or who literally dreads walking into a toxic, overly stressful night shift is going to default right back to survival mode. And what is survival mode? Exactly, it's defensiveness. A predictably safe and genuinely pleasant environment is an absolutely critical prerequisite to fostering that true freedom to produce we talked about earlier.
Now we reach the apex of the Avdel framework. Policy 3 states, to provide opportunity to all employees to learn and progress in accordance with their natural capabilities. The phrasing here is just so incredibly intentional and insightful. Notice those two words, natural capabilities. It openly acknowledges that not everyone on the shift is the exact same. Professional growth isn't some rigid, one-size-fits-all assembly line. By ensuring that development is highly individualized for every single worker, based on their own unique, inherent strengths, the organization shifts from merely managing people to actively cultivating their real potential. And so, what is the ultimate compounding payoff for diligently implementing these three policies? The source text concludes by identifying the intended outcome, building a team that is trained, efficient, and prideful. I really want to draw your attention specifically to that last word, prideful. It is the absolute direct antithesis of the defensiveness we analyzed at the very beginning of this explainer. By replacing the blunt instrument of supervisor power with granted freedom, genuine respect, a pleasant environment, and individualized growth, you totally transform a resistant, stubborn workforce into a highly capable team that actually takes deep personal pride in what they do. So as we wrap up our analysis of the Avdel night shift proposition, I won't leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought. Are you building compliance or are you building a prideful team? Take a hard, really honest look at your own workplace dynamics, your organizational culture, and your relationships with your supervisors or your own team. Are you trapped in that vicious cycle of escalating power and endless resistance, just demanding mere compliance? Or are you actively structuring policies that grant the freedom to produce? It's an incredibly powerful distinction and definitely one worth reflecting on long after this explainer ends. Thanks so much for joining me today, and as always, keep learning.